are civil society organizations welcoming this announcement from government? Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Gilad Isaacs, who is the director at the Institute for Economic Justice. Doc, thank you for joining me. So just shortly after the president spoke, I saw your tweet. You scored 50% of the chances that you took in terms of the measures that you had announced, in that you are saying the president implemented 5 out of 10 of what you had recommended as the IEJ, and you then go on to say good but not good enough. Why is it not good enough?
Excellent, thanks very much. Well, we launched about 2 weeks ago a 70 billion rand rescue package, which we thought would offer the kind of relief needed. From that, what we see is the extension of the social grants, which you mentioned, some relief from taxation, somewhat vague promises of business support grants, as well as the expansion of the TERS scheme. What we don't see is the full expansion of the SRD to all caregivers. What we don't see is the increase of that to the food poverty line. Also, what we don't see is the commitment to fund and expand the highly successful presidential employment stimulus. What we don't see is support for informal businesses. What we don't see is additional support for those who have become unemployed over this period. So we certainly welcome what was announced, but the economic circumstance call for both more urgent and more extensive action.
So just pulling out one of the threads that you mentioned there, the issue where you say the announcement by the president does not include all caregivers. Of course, one of the big announcements made by the president yesterday was that the SRD grant would now also include caregivers, those who are recipients of the caregiver grant, but who are also unemployed. Which category of caregiver is left out in your view?
Yeah, so when the expansion of emergency social grants were announced last year, you had a SRD grant for the adult unemployed who weren't receiving any other form of a grant, and you had an increase of 500 rand for all caregivers, which is about 7.1 million, who were a conduit for a child support grant on behalf of the dependent. What we've seen now by the extension of the SRD to unemployed caregivers is about an inclusion of about 3 to 4 million of that 7.1 million. But what's problematic, and we heard this from the minister now, is this almost obsessive adherence to an attempt to limit and target these grants, that every month there is a reapplication, as if it would be this terrible outcome if a few 100,000 people who had some level of short-term employment continue to receive this grant. And what we know is that it is caregivers in particular whose expenditure is essential for the provision of basic household needs. So both from an administrative point of view, where you could immediately implement the increase for all caregivers without any administrative burden, without applications and so on, and because of the benefit this gives to households, it would have been easier and more appropriate to simply extend it to all 7.1 caregivers who are a recipient or who are a conduit of a child support grant.
The other issue that you talk about, Dr. Isaacs, is your concern that there wasn't an announcement from the President that the SRD Social Relief of Distress Grant would be increased to the food poverty line. What do you mean by that? What would that have looked like?
Yeah, so what we know now is that it's at the 350 level. A food poverty line, it measures the minimum amount of calories which an individual needs. And importantly, actually, it only refers to the individual and not to the entire household. And in South Africa, that is currently at 585 Rand from last year, which is the amount needed to ensure that an adult can feed themselves. And so to offer a grant at a level below a basic subsistence really seems to not take account of the needs of the recipients.
And Dr. Gilad, from what you issued about 2 weeks ago as the IEJ, you had a figure attached to the package of 10 interventions to help, those who are in distress, but also to help businesses as well. And they amounted to about 70 billion Rand. Where would this funding come from? I mean, as we sit today, a lot of people are asking this question, which wasn't answered, to any greater detail other than to say due to increased revenue collection, and that was that. We don't know what's the full scope of this increased revenue collection. How sustainable is it? Do we have new revenue streams that are helping us in the country, etc.? Where would this funding come from to do all of the things that you're talking about, extend to all caregivers, 7.1 million, but also increase it to above the food poverty line?
Yeah, so about 40% of that fund is allocated from the unemployment insurance fund surplus, which is mainly in the TERS scheme and in other unemployment top-ups. The rest is allocated in our proposal from the unspent funds of the so-called 500 billion Rand stimulus last year, of which only around 207 billion have actually been used. So there's been a huge underspend on that proposed stimulus. But what we also need to bear in mind is that we need to ask ourselves not only is it affordable to implement these, but is it affordable not to implement these? As we've heard from the previous interviews which you've just had, with business closures, there's a sense that these businesses won't reopen. Now, it's far more costly to an economy, either to try and stimulate new businesses to open in 6 months' time, in a year's time. That's incredibly costly. And one loses tax revenue if businesses close. So the kind of vague promises which we heard last night about a business support scheme, which is 2 weeks after the first round of the business looting, is really not good enough. If we don't see a rapid rollout of support to these businesses now, it'll be more costly to the economy moving forward.
All right, I've got to thank you, Dr. Gilad Isaacs from the Institute for Economic Justice there, just reflecting on some of the announcements made by President Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday with regard to social relief of distress grants, but also other announcements around the support to businesses and tax matters, tax breaks, and the likes to try and help, I suppose, those who are struggling at the moment and help businesses to try and get back on their feet following recent events as well as the lockdown measures that have had to be implemented over the last 15 to 18 months or so.